Hello and welcome everybody to AI Ramblings, episode 39, with my colleague Neil McWana in white, me in my dour black. It's the third week of January. There's a freeze expanding all over the United States. Rain here in Texas, Houston. Neil, I hope you've been having a good start to the year.
Yeah, it's been good. Busy. Hopefully we have power this weekend, but other than that, it's been a good.
Fill up the
good start to the year.
bathtubs. Fill up the bathtubs. Because we Texans, we know how it is to live in a developing economy, just like half the world. Anyway, we have speaking of the global economy, Davos just wound down, the World Economic Forum, a lot of technology news there. So we got a lot of things to go over today. We narrowed it down for your viewing pleasure to a handful of items. Number one, we thought would be interesting to talk about would be OpenAI CFO Sarah Fryer at Davos put out an essay which is on their website, basically their case for their tremendously rising revenue metrics that are correlated, they argue, to their growth in AI compute, going from a fraction of a gigawatt of power for its data centers to over a gigawatt of power over the next year or two. And so basically they're making the case, please invest a lot more, help us spend $1 trillion or more on infrastructure so we can give you tens of billions of dollars of revenue growth. And it's one side of the AI argument out there, and they're the poster child for that. And that was item number one we thought we'd discuss. As usual, we've written a lot of detail about this. It'll be in the show notes, the links. But that's item number one. Item number two, Elon, not to be outdone, was also at Davos. And while he made grand postulations on the growth of space, one of the big IPOs anticipated this year is his SpaceX, which could be the first IPO to cross the $1 trillion mark. But he wants to give it a bit of a helping hand, as it were. And one of the big arguments he's making for SpaceX to be worth a bigger valuation, in addition to giving us propulsion all the way to Mars, is to also be a vehicle for creating AI data centers in space. This is something I wrote about extensively. I argue that AI data centers in space theoretically sound good, but there's a lot of science limitations, practical limitations in terms of the technologies today. So it's a very, very much in the future kind of thing. But Elon wants to focus on this as a core narrative to support his IPO thesis for SpaceX. So that was item number two we wanted to talk about today. Item number three, Google, which, as we've talked about since December, put OpenAI in a red alert mode, code red mode, I should say, in December, now is accelerating its momentum for Google Gemini, which they saw make progress with its consumer initiatives with Apple, the distribution deal that was announced a couple of weeks ago. Now they also seem to be making headway into the enterprise side of the market with developers. Millions of developers over the last 4 or 5 months are accelerating their use of Google Gemini for commercial applications, enterprise applications. And that is a shift from about a year ago, where Google was a distant player in terms of developer support. So those are the three major items we want to discuss. We also want to talk about Apple having a big design senior executive shift, which could potentially marks new directions for Apple this year and next. So we want to talk about that as a major topic. So those are the four things we kind of picked up out of the flood of things that are going on. Neil, any thoughts?
Yeah, couple. I mean, with the whole OpenAI thing, I think, this is a continuing trend that we've seen, trying to make this case that there is a justification to the current, valuations and scaling, concerns that are around AI in general, and especially with OpenAI leading that charge. So to see them kind of trying to ease tensions here is not a surprise. Again, we'll have to see how it plays out. You mentioned the SpaceX IPO. Of course, OpenAI is expected to also be going through a similar process this year. It'll be something we'll have to continue to track. But I did want to speak a bit on the whole Google developer momentum with Gemini specifically, just because of the fact that it builds on this thing that you've been talking about for a while, and that we have discussed a couple times on past episodes. Is Google being in pole position is kind of theirs to mess up at this point in terms of the AI race, if you want to call it that. Still, we do have players like Anthropic with Claude and Claude Code making pretty big announcements in the last couple of weeks. even as recent as yesterday, I believe they announced Excel support, which I know got a lot of buzz online because that was kind of the threshold for a lot of people that if it's able to help out in Excel, an area where many people who use Excel know I'm no expert, but it is a very complex and deeply technical platform, even though it may not seem like that sometimes on the surface. But I bring all that up to say that Google is in this position with Gemini and a lot of what they've been offering recently with announcements, and specifically where in this case competing with AWS in the cloud space, it just shows that they are kind of competing on all fronts here, just due to the amount of power they have internally and the staff that they have to be able to kind of execute on these things. It puts them in a very unique position, and it's just another thing I wanted to highlight a bit.
No, great point. I mean, the big knock on Google a few months ago, and I wrote about this back then, was that developers were finding that the tools that developers could use to integrate Google's models into their daily workflows through APIs were far lacking versus the similar things from OpenAI, from Anthropic Claude, as you mentioned. But they've done a lot. Google seems to have done a lot of catch up on that front. And they are also taking lead on things like interoperable SaaS standards. We talked about UCP, the Universal Commerce Protocol, a week ago. They've got big payment open initiatives that link agents in AI to transactions on AI-driven initiatives, which is a big holy grail for a lot of the industry going forward. So yeah, Google seems to be making a lot of headway. And so the frenetic race, the one-upmanship that's going on amongst these companies continues to pace. And, OpenAI should consider Code Red as a relative reality for them over the next few months, given the intensity of this space. In fact, Google's DeepMind head, Demis Hassabis, who's their AI head at Davos, acknowledged that the company is on a totally different startup-oriented footing, that they're accelerating a lot more on execution. They productize things a lot faster. Witness their text to video stuff with Nano Banana as an example. So Google, has a little head of steam, and that continues to be showing. OpenAI, in the meantime, as we talked about, is just continuing to be on a tear in terms of building financing partnerships for infrastructure. That was the case that they're making, that they need to continue to raise gobs and gobs of money to be able to build AI compute in order to deliver a lot of revenues and hopefully at some point other financial metrics, which go into margins and so on, which I want to talk about later in the episode today, which all takes us to our topic of the week. Because of the Mag 7s, everyone has kind of, assumed Apple as behind in the AI race, which, you and I have argued that that's not the case. Apple continues to be, in my mind, one of the best positioned big companies for AI leadership. And in that context, they made a big change in their senior management. John Turnus, who is their manufacturing head, 50 years old, young, relative to the senior executive of Apple's leadership, including Tim Cook, who just turned 65 and is going to be in charge for a while. But Turnus, who has been kind of potentially pointed at as the possible next CEO, he got a new additional title added to his name. Remember, Apple lost their design chief to Meta a few weeks ago, Alan Dye. We talked about that at length. But Apple is now apparently tapped internally John Turnus to be the executive sponsor of all design within Apple. So he's now the link to all the design work that, Johnny Ive, who now works with OpenAI to build a portfolio of AI devices expected later this year. So John Turnus is now the design link, let's call him the design czar, that connects Apple's design functionality across all its hardware and software platforms, all the way to the senior leadership reporting to Tim Cook, of course. And at the same time, they've also consolidated a lot of the AI leadership, software and hardware, under Craig Federighi, who's the software head of Apple. And so with those two changes, the company is very surely steering its entire set of platforms toward much more definitive AI executions, AI-enabled Siri later this year, now with Google Gemini as a underlying technology provider, which they announced a few days ago. So there's a little bit more clarity on Apple's directions on AI, especially at the senior management level. Everyone just assumes, Apple's leadership is so They're all in their 60s. There's a transition. Yes, there is that, but they have a deep bench of management. John Turnus is just one of several folks. We wrote about some of the other folks in a post just a couple of days ago. We'll put it up in the show notes. But this is a big shift at Apple that I wanted to talk about as our major topic, because both you and I are students and analysts of all things Apple. What do you think?
Yeah, the Turnus thing is something I think we discussed a couple episodes back, but I did want to bring up something interesting that we've talked about offline is that obviously Steve Jobs was the design guy who I think focused the most on what a lot of these Apple devices mean to people and how well thought out they were from a user experience point of view. Then Tim Cook came in, obviously the supply chain guy, was able to scale Apple in a way that it hadn't been done before with manufacturing. And the interesting thing about Turnus is it's funny, every time I see Turnus in an interview, which has been increasingly more in the last couple of years and, even months, as they're kind of pointing internally that this might be the next guy, you always see him in a manufacturing setting. He's always in a factory. He's always near some sort of machinery where they're showing how the Apple devices are being tested for ruggedness and durability and stuff. So it's interesting that this succeeder of Tim Cook would have this new facet of expertise that hasn't been maybe the main quality of an Apple CEO in recent terms, with Steve being the design guy, Tim being the supply chain guy, now, John being the more hardware feasibility, I guess is the word I was thinking in my head, is that, how do we actually make these things in a way that they work and they work well for a while? The reason I say that is because I wonder if that'll mark a shift in how Apple approaches product under John. So I kind of wanted to talk about that with you. Is that, do you think that this new person that will be coming in with this kind of everyone at Apple obviously has to be cross functional and work across a lot of different areas, and of course they have a very large team of experts in many areas. But do you think that this potential shift, it's not anything that's going to happen immediately, it seems, but that'll eventually happen? Do you think that could signal a culture shift in Apple in the way that they approach their product?
I don't think it's a culture shift in that sense. I think this is a transition to a younger generation. Note that, Turnus is, 15 years gap, right, with the senior leadership who are in their 60s. Those types of framework transitions are important to note. But at the same time, Turnus has been there for a very long time. And so he's off the culture. So I don't think it's a dramatic shift per se on that side of the equation. I remember when Alan Dye was poached from Apple to Meta, he was viewed not as a pure design person. He was viewed internally. He was viewed as a branding type of person. So in that sense, this was a shift back to its Apple's roots. I kind of view Turnus's pick as a manufacturing guy who pays attention to the details of the atoms, the physical components, but bring a design halo to the thing. That is a little similar to Apple, Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs was not a manufacturing expert, but he had huge taste, as it were, in terms of all things design, hardware and software. And so and we don't know Turnus's design chops, as it were, right? Other than, if you just judge him by the products that were manufactured of late, even the iPhone 17, which got good marks for the introduction of liquid cooling and all these other technically complex things to build into these products. I think this is a continuation of a younger generation of Apple's effort to utterly fuse hardware, software, design, user experience in a more functional way. So in that sense, I'm optimistic that we're going back to its roots versus some of the deviations that we may have had with folks like Dye and others. So we're a little bit in the weeds on the Apple people bench kind of equation, but people matter. The other aspect which I wrote about in my post, this is John Turnus. Johnny Ive was the big design guy who, under Steve Jobs, helped create, the iPhone and all these other iconic products. The third Johnny, as it were, which I write about in my post, is Johnny, Johny Shruji, who has led Apple Silicon, which most of us don't think about, but the ability for Apple to transition from Intel to its own semiconductor chips over the last 6 or 7 years were revolutionary in the manufacture of laptops and now iPhones that have a very customized, unique architecture from a chip level point of view, made at TSMC for Apple. And Shruji had that, and that gave Apple a leadership in power efficiency and performance efficiency of the compute with AI compute on the chip under Shruji that was unrivaled until just the last 2 or 3 years now, with Qualcomm and ARM and other people starting to catch up a little bit. So Apple has always focused on getting the nexus of hardware software design. And this, I think, is just another refocus of that with this change. So I'm not as intrigued by Turnus himself. I'm intrigued by the notion that the company is reassessing and reconfiguring, refocusing its folks, young and old, to the task at hand, which is executing all of this against these tremendous AI opportunities that are ahead, and also kind of hopefully showing us that AI is not just about chatbots that we've seen over the last 3 years. AI is a lot more. One of the things, by the way, we'll talk about it on a future show. I'm very excited about something Apple announced actually. It'll be released in the next week. We should talk about it next week. Is the Apple Creative Studio, which is a subscription layer on most Apple productivity apps that they're just going to make available for, I think, a $20 a month subscription. You're going to get a lot of AI functionality across their productivity apps like Pages and Numbers and Keynote, and their creative apps, things like that allow people to edit video, edit images, etc. And there's a subscription layer around this Creative Studio, which again is going to be another stake in the ground that says there's a lot of design work to be done with AI, and that is what Apple is going to be introducing. And these management changes are indicative that they're very much focused on those opportunities. So for all of those reasons, I think all of this bears discussion as our major topic of the week. And I hope that's it's a long answer to your great question, but that's how I'm viewing it.
Yeah, exactly. That was the whole kind of idea behind it. Is does this mark a shift in how
Yeah.
they're approaching things?
So yeah, I think it's a re-steering of the aircraft carrier, of the ship, as it were, which takes us to our watch and reads of the week in terms of a lot of stuff going on. Why don't you kick us off on this front? What did you think that was interesting this week?
Yeah. So my watch read of the week was something that, again, probably ruffled a couple of feathers when it was announced earlier this week, I believe. But it was at OpenAI saying last Friday that they are going to start serving ads in the free version of ChatGPT over the next several weeks. This is something that had been rumored for a while. People were wondering how it was going to happen, how obvious it was going to be. I think the signs were there in the last couple of months, but it's official now that's going to be rolled out in this beta testing way, where it's going to be in the free version, and people will obviously be able to tell if it's an ad or not. I think it brings up a discussion that we had a bit with AI browsers and how the new internet is going to be monetized in terms of, our ad model is going to change, and how is revenue going to work on that side of things. This is, I believe, one of the first times we've seen this in a chatbot, at least on this scale, with ChatGPT and OpenAI being the front runners from a commercial point of view that everyone kind of goes through for most things. And I just kind of want to have a discussion on how you think this is going to shake up the perception of it potentially in the long run, as I'm sure you've seen this in past tech waves with a lot of the internet companies in early days moving to support ads. Obviously, Google's biggest revenue stream being the ad share that they have. I thought it would just be an interesting thing for us to kind of touch on a bit here.
No, I look at the advertising piece has been a long time focus for OpenAI, and the flip flop, right? Sam Altman famously a couple of years ago said, he was not inclined to think about ads for monetizing its AI products, that they were much more focused on subscriptions and transactions via APIs. The three core ways to make money on the internet is obviously ads is a big one, subscriptions is another one, and transactions. And OpenAI for the longest time was focused on 2 out of 3. Now with ads, they're going along with this here. It was interesting at Davos, Demis Hassabis, the AI head at Google, decided to take a poke saying, we're not going to use ads in our AI overviews in Gemini or AI mode. Of course, and Google's entire business model is based on AI, so and ads. So it was an opportunistic poke in the OpenAI eye, as it were. But those kinds of theatrics notwithstanding, ads are going to be a very key piece of this. And OpenAI is focused on this. They showed some examples of this, which are based around transactions, e-commerce things, etc. Everyone thinks, the AI agents are going to lead to transactions, buying things. That's why all of these companies are racing to partner with companies like retailers like Walmart and Target and so on. We had a big piece on Google and UCP, the Universal Commerce Protocol. So ads are part and parcel of this function. I mean, let's not forget Amazon, which, until a few years ago was all about transactions and AWS and API and so on, and no ads, has become the number 3 purveyor of ads and creator of ad revenues behind Google and Meta. And so all of these 3 stools of monetizing the internet are part and parcel. And OpenAI focused on ads is the natural thing for them to do, code red or no code red. And so, yes, it's good to see them refocused on the opportunity. And I think your article is a worthy read of the week. So people should absolutely go through it. And all of this, by the way, gets into my read of the week, which is an ongoing debate. As an analyst of technology for 30 years, I'm constantly focused on how margins of these companies evolve as they go from lower parts of the tech stack to the higher parts of the tech stack, which are higher margin. And one of the things, and I've written a lot of posts, we'll have some links in the show notes on some previous posts on this topic. But there was new data that basically said Anthropic, which relative to OpenAI has higher margins because they're focused more on the enterprise side. So in theory, their revenue growth has higher margins associated with them. But even for them, they downgraded their margin expectations a little bit, 500 basis points. And again, because of the rising infrastructure investments in data centers that they're also going to need, gigawatts of data centers as well, tens of billions of dollars of expenditures. They're again raising lots more money at bigger valuations to fund all this, and that has margin impact. So this margin impact on growth while you're increasing AI compute is a key piece. And I have not one but several reads of the week in my listing for the week, for people interested, with 1 or 2 pieces up that are listed on top as being a good overall summary of the issue and the opportunity. So margins is my read of the week topic for the week. So, and it's tied to your question and read of the week on the ads, because ads are the highest margin type of revenues. And that's the holy grail again, that everyone wants a good mix of these 3 revenue streams, which takes us to our obsessions of the week, Neil. And again, I'll let you lead us into it.
Yeah, it's another piece from the New York Times talking about, is AI able to generate new ideas? This is, of course, a long-standing discussion regarding AGI in general, but this article more or less focuses on how systems like OpenAI's GPT-5 are accelerating research in areas like math, biology, and chemistry, but there is still a debate on whether or not it can do a lot of that work on its own. I guess a bit of context for what sparked the debate here. There was a startup called Harmonic, and they claimed that one of their AI systems, which was working with ChatGPT, was able to solve, not to get into the math specifics, but it was a really complex, long-standing math problem, which is pretty famous. And it was said that GPT-5 was able to solve multiple of these previously unsolved problems, but mathematicians still showed that a lot of these solutions, if you were to say, were actually just rediscoveries of other results buried in other papers, which prompted a bit of debate as to what is considered solving a new idea versus, what is building on things that have already existed. So I guess it's more or less also a conversation of what constitutes something being a new idea. How can we actually quantify if AI is able to discover new things in these areas? We obviously know that a lot of these models right now are probabilistic in their nature, and it's something that sparked debate in terms of, is this something that can be leveraged in a way that provides new value that isn't just regurgitating things that it's been trained on? It's a discussion you and I have had a bit offline, but I kind of wanted to bring it to the table here so we can talk about it.
No, it's a good topic to focus on, and that would be an important item to focus on in terms of the new developments. I mean, look, we've talked about this in the sense that as AI scales, the capabilities leapfrog one year to the next. And a consensus is that today's AI as good as it is still not there to generate entirely new ideas, but we're on the cusp of it. Not in terms of years, but in probably in terms of months. And that's what the billions of dollars of investments are basically leaning toward. And Anthropic, OpenAI in particular, are leaning into this. In fact, Sarah Fryer, the CFO at Davos, also postulated that, that OpenAI is partnering with healthcare companies. Nvidia just is partnering with Eli Lilly of $1 billion. Eli Lilly is going to invest in NVIDIA powered data centers. And the idea, OpenAI actually said, hey, maybe there's an opportunity in addition for us to make money through ads, through subscriptions, through transactions via APIs. Maybe if our models, which are being specialized around healthcare, as an instance, she gave an argument that if they help drug company X create a new drug, that maybe OpenAI should get a piece of the earnings from that drug that they help invent. And that would be an entirely new direction for these software companies to basically create revenue. That's not been done before. It's almost like a musician saying, I wrote this song, and so for the next 60 years, you owe me royalties for this song, Let It Be or whatever the song is. And that is, we've not seen that in the domain of software. We've seen that in the domain of media software. But this is a new thing. AI, as and when it creates new ideas, there are a whole bunch of issues. How should the revenues and profits of that be apportioned? Today, the Copyright Office actually says if AI creates a work of art or a piece of intellectual property, that is not copyrightable under today's copyright regimes because it has to be touched by a human. And so one of the races is if someone discovers a drug through AI or something else, you better tweak it, and document it that a human scientist mucked around with it, then copyright it, then trademark it, then you can get the royalties and the IP rights. These are all minute tactical things that we've got to wrestle with, and that's all, of course, assuming that the AI can generate new non-regurgitated ideas, and that is a big if. But I do think, as a daily user of AI, that yes, the AIs are going to throw out new possibilities that then will be experimented on for drugs, for legal arguments, for any domain that we care to name. And yes, the AIs, as their people build hybrid systems underneath them to create and test the products and ideas, we will see new things generated by AI today as tools, tomorrow as collaborators of humans. Okay. And when that today to tomorrow line is crossed over is anyone's guess. And there's a big debate. I know it could be happening in weeks or months versus years or decades. And the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But it's a great point to obsess over at this point. And so I applaud your pick for the obsession of the week. My obsession of the week, Neil, is something that has been a daily obsession of mine every day, which is TikTok. I use TikTok as I use YouTube, as I think you do, for discovery of new ideas, etc. And the big question for TikTok under U.S. law is, hey, it needs to be spun off to a U.S. entity, which took about a year or so, but that transaction was finally done. So I've got a bunch of links on the whole TikTok saga. It's now going to be owned by primarily U.S. investors. Only 20% of it is owned by ByteDance, which is the parent company in China. The rest of them are all U.S. institutional investors, with the majority of the board basically being U.S. investors. The algorithm is still going to be in China, but it'll be tweaked and documentable as U.S. domiciled. And so a lot of the things have been tweaked, and it's not entirely clear after a year or two of this geopolitical wrangling around this thing if the actual experience of TikTok is going to be any different. I think it remains to be seen, but it'll likely be more same than not. So after all of this drama and kabuki theater about TikTok and US China geopolitics and so on, that we may end up being at a point where for daily multi-hundred million users of TikTok in the US, the answer may be meh. There was no major change or difference, but that remains to be seen. But that chapter has closed. We now have a US TikTok, and that is my obsession of the week, and an obsession for the rest of the year to determine if TikTok has changed, because I do enjoy it. I do think it provides a lot of value. I think it's a global internet AI treasure, even though it has been emulated, some would say copied, by companies like Meta with Reels and Instagram and WhatsApp and so on, by YouTube with Shorts and so on. But TikTok is still TikTok, and it's now a US company. So that's my obsession of the week topic for episode 39. So that brings us to our burning questions, Neil. And my burning questions, I'll kick it off on this one. We talked about favorite, everything AI, etc. But as we go into 2026, Neil, what is your biggest AI pain point? If you
Yeah.
could identify, oh my God, if they'd only fix this.
Yeah, they recently added Gemini into like a lot of the Google Home devices that we have at the house. It was kind of, a prompt that we got on the app that, hey, Gemini's here for Google Home. Would you like to add it? I'm like, sure, why not? Hopefully this will help us a bit here. And it's a really big pain point for me because I think it's kind of ruined the experience of Google Home a bit, because we use it for a very simple thing every day to turn on and off all the lights that we have in the house. We have a bunch of lamps, um, and and lights throughout the house. Earlier it was a very, hey, turn all the lights off. It would happen instantly. Now you have to say it multiple times, and even once you say it, it takes significantly longer for it to actually happen than when it was like a couple months ago. So pain point is in we've somehow moved backwards in this area, which is a bit frustrating. Again, this is still early days on this stuff, so you're gonna have to give it some time to develop. The voice in general has been a pain point for me, and it's something we've discussed. And it's actually what I wanted to ask you for my burning question was, for you, is there a threshold or is there an instance that you can see? We talk a lot about how this stuff is influenced by sci-fi and Star Trek and stuff like that. uh, is there an instance that you would see in your head where it's like almost like a Turing test for voice in your eyes, where if you're able to do a certain thing right now that you're not able to do currently, would that kind of prove to you that we've made progress in this area?
There's no question we've made a lot of progress on voice on the internet. In fact, it's extraordinary. I think we've blown through the Turing tests, etc. Almost every, especially ChatGPT, its voice quality, the choices that they gives you. I just noticed they now give you 6 choices of intonations of chatty people versus professional, etc. They're also trying to get into the spicier tones. They've actually got a voice that has a heart emoji, so it's obvious where they're going with that. If you pick that personality, it's not just voice, it's personalities and so on, because they know these things are going to get anthropomorphized by people, and they're going to create emotional attachment so that the subscriptions will last longer and maybe even upgrade, etc. So there is an explicit move, especially by OpenAI and Meta and by Elon's XAI, go through in that companionship route using voice, etc. So I do think we have blown through the Turing type of voice emulation parts of these technologies, even the much more professional and my preferred Google Gemini version of the voice, which is more like enterprise, Starship Enterprise type of professional voice, just focusing on business like a business environment. And I prefer that. Having said that, to kind of tie it to the pain point that you identified in your burning question, one of the core issues for all of these companies is, again, AI compute, which is one of the core topics we started this discussion with. AI compute depends on getting your data centers up, and that there is a distinct 2-3 year lag in terms of building that compute, and there's a shortage of this. And so you will find, even when I used Claude Code extensively this week, and there were many times when I had to wait not just 100 milliseconds or even a few seconds, but actually had to wait a minute or two for the processing to be finished because it didn't have enough capacity to give me the answers. Even with AI voice, if I'm talking to ChatGPT or Gemini, I will find gaps, 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds, because it skips because it can't get enough compute in the back end. It's very similar for those of you were not born in those days, but in the 90s, when people were accessing AOL, which was the internet, you had to go through minutes of dial-up to get access to go online, to actually connect with the computers, to be actually do anything online. We're in that stage right now again with compute, whether it's for AI voice, for AI compute, AI reasoning, coding, all of these things. There is um, a gap between the computation available for that and your ability to access that at the price point you want to pay. And so that is a pain point that will stay with us for this year and next. and it alleviates, of course, if you end up paying Google or OpenAI $200 or $2,000 a month, you might get much faster access. But it is a pain point. In the meantime, your core question, yeah, I think we are at a AI voice piece of this equation, which is passing the Turing test piece of the equation. So that it's a great question. That brings us to the end of our episode 39. We again want to thank you all for joining us. We had talked about a lot of interesting things. If you have any comments, suggestions, feedback, please pass them along. And as usual, a like and a subscribe is always appreciated. And we invite you to join us for episode 40 next week. And thank you for joining us. Stay tuned.
Thank you.